بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لم يكن الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب والمشركين منفكين وتأتيهم هم البينة وثور من لا يألثوا فمتخذ فيها كتب قيمة وما تفوق الذين أوتوا الكتاب إلا من بعد ما جاءتهم البينة وما أمروا إلا ليعبدوا الله مخلصين له الدين حنفاء ويقيموا الصلاة ويؤتوا الزكاة وذلك دين القيمة إن الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب والمشركين في نار جهنم خالدين فيها أولئك هم شر البرية جزاء من دون إن الذين آمنوا وتواصوا وعملوا الصالحات أولئك هم خير البرية جزاء من ربهم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا رضي الله عنهم ورضوان ذلك من خشي ربه صدق الله العظيم.
أحسنت. صلوات again على سلام محمد وآل محمد. Beautiful to hear some of our young children reciting so beautifully and so well off by heart. We're now very fortunate to have Marwa, who will be speaking to us right now. Let's welcome Salat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. As part of the children's classes, we invited Mahdi Kareem from MK Academy to deliver a workshop on public speaking. And since then, children have had the opportunity to write a speech on a topic of their choice. And so today we will hear from Marwa al-Bakri, who will give us a few minutes. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Let's stop climate change together because we did this. Hello, my name is Marwa and I'll be talking to you about something very, 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 and I repeat, very important. Climate change. Climate change is when the earth is getting hotter, mainly from human activities that cause greenhouse gas emissions. Human activities such as burning fossil fuels like coal, oil and gas releases dangerous carbon emissions. Also cutting down forests like the Amazon rainforest, driving big SUV cars, aeroplane emissions all contribute to the increasing of greenhouse gas emissions. To be honest, I am angry with all the grown-ups. They're saying we're doing everything to help, but they're not. Adults, are you listening? I hate the thing when adults go and care about the future, but there's hardly a future. You see, us kids, we don't have much power, so I recommend you adults collecting rubbish, challenging the Prime Minister, and convincing other people to help. You know the plastic bottles you get from the shops? Why not recycle them? Why not recycle them by filling them with water? Or make a craft with your recycling. Remember to put recycling in the recycling bin, and the waste in the waste bin, and the compost in the compost bin. Recycling you should put in the recycling bin is cardboard, paper, etc. But in the waste bin, yogurt cups, packets, and plastic cups, and banana peels, sloppy apples, and other disgusting stuff in the compost bin. Hello, are you listening? If you're not, don't just say sounds like a you problem, not a me problem, because I've heard my classmates say it. Do you know the consequences of not caring about climate change? Well, one scenario is countries having heat waves, really hot temperature, and dry weather that caused wildfires like we saw in the US. Another scenario is so Range Rovers, Land Rovers and other big cars will become popular and tons of people will buy it. You may be thinking, what's the problem with that? What's the problem with that? I'll tell you what the problem is. Well, they're 20% more polluting than a normal car. It will contribute to the melting of icebergs, losing their homes, and people will starve because the fish and chicken will die. And the fruit and veg won't be able to grow because they'll drown or get too much sunlight. And plants will also die. Well, the air is twice as bad, so you would probably die. If you don't feel scared, then you can come up to the stage and explain why. I'm happy for feedback. Well, it sounds awful. Well, I can tell you a few things to help. Now, walk, cycle, or take public transport. The world's road is clogged with vehicles, most of them diesel or petrol. Walking or riding a bike instead of driving, will help your health and fitness. For longer distance, consider taking train whenever possible, and carpooling whenever possible. Throw less food. When you throw food away, you are also wasting resources and energy we used to grow. Produce, package, and transport. And the food rots in the landfill. It produces methane, a powerful greenhouse gas. So use what you buy, compost any leftovers, reduce, reuse, repair, recycle. Electronics, clothes, and other items we buy cause carbon emissions of raw material to manufacture and transport goods to a market. To protect our climate, buy fewer clothes, shop second-hand clothes, repair what you can, and recycle. Switch to an electric vehicle. If you plan to buy a car, consider going electric with more and cheaper models coming from the shop. I also remember saying, if I became a prime minister, I will make people with big cars pay extra tax, make hybrid cars cheaper, and make more charging points for electric cars. Do you have any ideas what to do? I end the speech with one message, the same as the title. Let's stop climate change together because we did this. That's my last word on climate change. Thanks for listening to my talk. Marwa al-Bakri.
And salawat again for a brilliant speech. Salawat. Thank you very much, Marwa, for that today. Now we are very fortunate to have Amina Inloes, who will be speaking to us on the wafat of Imam Ali Rida on the topic, what would Imam Rida alayhi salam have said about the theory of evolution. Let's welcome her. Salat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Amina is a lecturer at the Islamic College in London. She has a PhD in Arab and Islamic Studies from the University of Exeter. She's the author of Women in Shiism, Ancient Stories, Modern Ideologies, and has translated works on Islamic spirituality and tafsir. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الكريم أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وإذ قال ربك للملائكة إني جاعل في الأرض خليفة قالوا أتجعل فيها من يفسد فيها ويسفك الدماء ونحن نسبح بحمدك ونقدس لك قال إني أعلم ما لا تعلمون. And when your Lord said to the angels, I am placing upon the earth a representative, they said, are you going to place upon it one who's going to corrupt it? Which is incidentally one of the tafsir of that is what the young lady was speaking about before. Some people do say fasad in the Quran is climate change. Anyway, because it's something we do by our own hands, especially by our wrong actions and the corporate wrong actions. Right, well, no more inline tafsir of Quran here. Yufsidu fiha, that they will cause corruption in it and shed blood, whereas we, the angels, celebrate your praise and sanctify you. And God said, I know better what you do not know. Sadaqallahu al-Ali al-Azim. So we have perhaps two disparate things on the screen right here. We have Imam Rida, peace be upon him, and we are commemorating his shahadat today with a rather unusual question. What would he have said about the theory of evolution? Which I would guess that most of us are familiar with, at least, the scientific theory of the origin of species, and in this case in particular, the human being. And especially the younger people might have come across it by now in school, or they're likely to on their educational journey here. And in many places in the world, that will be the case. But sometimes we don't necessarily put these two together. Now, I'm not going to put words in Imam Rida's mouth and say exactly what I think he would have said unless it's an actual quotation attributed to him. But nonetheless, we can use this as an interesting issue to consider some dynamics of thought and some views on the topic as well. But we not only have two disparate ideas on the screen here, we have some pictures which are thematically quite different. I would say there's at least three separate ideological frameworks that are coexisting uncomfortably or comfortably on this picture. You may be familiar with the top drawing by Ustad Mahmoud Farshian. I used to know his grandson, who's named Masood. It's Mahmoud Farshian. He used to send me a lot of his artwork, so that's how I first became familiar with it. Anyway, and this is a story of, as you probably recognize, Imam Rida, peace be upon him, guaranteeing safety to the gazelle who was upset that the hunter was going to kill its children. And you see the hunter there repenting for his actions and feeling bad about that. Those are many ideas. Oh, and incidentally, I found out recently, because I didn't know this, that the painter painted this after he had a vision of Imam Rida. He was about to go in for heart surgery, and then he had a vision of Imam Rida, and then when they went to do the surgery, he says they didn't find anything wrong with his heart. So he painted the picture in honor of that. Now, some people might argue at this point, but that's not what he should look like ethnically. I don't think spiritual visions need to be like 100% on the mark, like in terms of what we actually look like. I think it's fine that people would see something they would recognize, that he would understand this is Imam Rida, not that he's like the exact face that people saw in the past. Or maybe he wanted to paint him like that. But he said that's one reason why he painted him with his face showing as opposed to covering it, with a light or something. But those are a lot of ideas that don't really fit into the scientific secular paradigm of today, right? Like first Imam Rida is talking to a gazelle. We're not supposed to talk to animals. We're above animals on the intellect chain, even though of course it happens in the Quran, but that doesn't fit into the model that we learn in school. Natural selection's about survival of the fittest, so the gazelle just wasn't fit enough for it or its kids to survive. So, this act of compassion seems to be against this idea of natural selection, which sometimes informs people's viewpoints. Definitely having visions and miraculous healings are not part of the, I think the world is changing, but certainly when I was in school, they weren't part of the scientific paradigm. So we have one worldview there. And on the bottom, of course, we have two worldviews. You have the idea of the development of human beings through evolution from animals, with a lot of scientific and mathematical imagery. But then, of course, you have the ultimate conclusion there, which is the sajda to Allah. And that's not something that's necessarily understood to be the end goal of humanity in the secular scientific worldview. Religion and Allah tends to take a bit of a backseat to the dominance of the human being, and the human being all there is. Or at least, again, that's what it was like up until fairly recently. So we have a lot going on here. So how do we put them all together? Well, one reason we can think about this is during the lifetime of Imam Rida, peace be upon him. As we know, this was a time of tremendous scientific output, philosophical discussion, theological discussion, and a lot of thinking and writing and translating among Muslims. And we're probably familiar with some of the accounts of theological debates that Imam Rida might have been, or was, that are recorded that he was invited to, for example, by the Caliph Ma'mun. Sometimes discussing some scientific matters. Now, some people might say, well, he was invited to these things because the caliph wanted to discredit him and, make him look bad. And then invariably he would demonstrate his mastery of the subjects, be they spiritual, theological, scientific, whatever they happen to be. And you can find a number of these dialogues recorded in our books of hadith. Among them, of course, being the famous Uyun Akhbar Rida, peace be upon him, but there's a great many more in other sources as well, even though that's a long compilation. But nonetheless, it's also a reminder of how vibrant a time that was in our history for discussing different ideas. And he was one of the imams who was very much at the forefront of public discussion. He was very much in the public eye, and he was able to discuss convincingly these ideas without necessarily just simply shooting down the idea of discussion, if I may, because I think I'm allowed to say this here. I'm not allowed to say it everywhere. But, as Muslims, I feel like in this day and age, we've got a little bit of a, what do you call it? When you believe two things that are conflicting at once. On the one hand, we say that Allah wants us to question, and Islam encourages thinking and the intellect and questioning. But then if you actually start questioning, unless you get to exactly the answer the person who's listening to you wants, then they get mad at you, and then they don't allow you to question anymore. Or they say you're not allowed to ask about that, you're not allowed to discuss that. And I think there are fewer taboo subjects today than there were, again, maybe 20 or 30 years ago. But nonetheless, we do have to make up our minds. Either Islam is a religion and the Quran is a book which encourages us to use the intellect and to think and to discuss and ask, which is something Imam Rida was demonstrating very well, as indeed the other imams did as well, or we don't, and we say you just take it on faith and you don't ask. But you can't, as they say, have your cake and eat it too. So he is definitely, he lived in a time of a lot of intellectual vibrancy, and he also participated in that. So, if Imam Rida were confronted with the theory of evolution, whether it be right or wrong, I'm not going to pass judgment on that right now. Not being Allah, I don't have absolute answers for every scientific or other question in the world. I think he would have, first of all, been willing to discuss it and to look into it in depth and in a knowledgeable manner. And also, he would have looked at some of the broader issues surrounding it. When we were looking at the previous slide, I was mentioning some worldviews that we encounter or we have encountered in our lives that are present in the world. And I think he would have been cognizant of the underlying political dynamics of some of these discussions, that they aren't always about abstract science or even abstract faith. Because he was very alert to the situations of his times. So that's how I think he would have handled it, even if I can't say 100% what I think he would have said. Now, I do have opinions about the topic, but I will spare you some of my less founded opinions and focus on the subject. So when we want to talk about the theory of evolution, it's an interesting one with respect to religion, at least the Abrahamic religions, although I've heard some interesting discussion from Hindu perspectives. But I think especially Christianity, of course, has had a particularly hard time with it. We do know that in the country where I'm from, that there was a big uproar over teaching evolution in schools, and I think it still isn't done in some places due to religious opposition. Not where I'm from, because I'm not from a Christian fundamentalist place, but some parts of the country are like that. So it's a very loaded topic with respect to religion, especially Christianity. But Muslims have had, I don't think it's been as controversial among Muslims, but certainly it's a sensitive issue among some Muslims. Some more so than others. I think by and large, if I can summarize my sort of sense of where the Muslim world has been. This is a generalization. Maybe I could just ask you all, because you'd probably tell me what you think of it. Yeah, why not? Raise your hand if you're in favor of the theory of evolution for species other than humans. I'm presupposing you know what it is, because obviously there's a lot of things that one could break that down into, but in general. So you're cool with like cats evolving. Okay, keep your hand up if you're okay with it for Neanderthals. Okay, what about humans? Like our humans, us, we evolved. Okay, raise your hand if you are very much against it, and you'll go home with nightmares if I'm advocating it. Okay, anyone doesn't know? Raise your hand if you just don't know. Okay, fair enough, and we might have some viewpoints in between. And certainly there have been some Muslims who have been very opposed to it. I've been told that when ISIS took over some places, they banned it being taught in schools, for example. And in some Muslim countries, I've recently discovered that it has been pulled from the curriculum for whatever reason. But by and large, I think it hasn't been as much of an issue among us, but there still has been a broad variety of responses. However, I think some of the complicating factors for Muslim responses to the theory of evolution are, well, they're up there. One is that when it first hit the Muslim world, and it seems like we started to get responses to it towards the end of the 19th century-ish. Don't like flame me online for the exact date. And especially in the past century, there has been a lot of debate for and against it, including among Shi'i thinkers and scholars, but Muslims by and large. It was, of course, in the framework of something that was coming from the West, along with the whole colonialist project. So among those people who felt the West, rightly or wrongly, felt that the Western powers, at that time the European powers, were attacking Islam, there were some people who thought perhaps this is another attack on faith, because it couldn't be construed as a very material way of understanding the origin of the human being, which is not God's creation. On the other hand, we do know that some Christian, if I may, fundamentalist groups were and are very much against it, and also were very much against other ideas that were unsurfacing at the time, like the idea that the earth is very old and it's not just, relatively recent, as can be calculated through biblical genealogies and so forth. Some Muslims do actually copy Christian fundamentalist ideas. I don't know if you're alert to that, but you do find some people, I don't know if it's laziness or they just like them, but they will repackage what certain people are saying in some quote-unquote Christian fundamentalist circles and then put it on their Islamic social media, which I have issues with. I mean, I don't have a problem with it if someone is just copying something because they think it's right and they love it. But sometimes they're not necessarily, in my opinion, thinking things through 100%. That definitely happens with evolution. It does happen with other issues. So that's something you could perhaps ponder the next time you're on Instagram. But you don't waste your lives on Instagram, do you? Or TikTok, or these things. On the other hand, we have as Muslims, and we were discussing this a bit on Monday for those of us who are at an interesting seminar on artificial intelligence and theological things. We Muslims have also felt a strong drive to harmonize Islam and science. So if scientists are saying that people evolved or life was able to develop on Earth through a means other than full divine intervention that was miraculous, then definitely, there are movements among Muslims who will attempt to find that in the Quran, less so in the Hadith, but definitely in the Quran. So that's another complicating factor, which is more specific to Islam. And then there's just the whole modern world ideology. This is a quotation from Sayyid Hussein Nasr. Well, I don't know how y'all feel about him. Some people have very strong feelings about him. It's an interesting quote anyway. The theory of evolution is the peg of the tent of modernism. And if it were to fall down, the whole tent would fall on top of the head of modernism. And therefore it is kept as an ideology and not as a scientific theory which has been proven. Okay, I see a confused or objecting look. I think that's a fair observation. Scientific theory, going back to what I was saying about the political dimensions of things, if you're just having abstract science, it's actually hard to think of a scientific issue or inquiry which is genuinely neutral because there are so many corporate and political interests in scientific research. But if I were researching something about the composition of water, maybe that might be neutral. But evolution is not a neutral topic. It is very ideologically charged. A good way to get fired from a university job is to, completely oppose it. There's a small number of issues, or maybe it's not small, I don't know. But there are certain issues that even today you can't discuss in the academic world because they're taboo in their own way. It's just we have a different set of taboos. So if one is going to be opposing evolution, there are certain ways it can be done, but one has to be very careful of that. So that also colors how we treat it too, whether we're for or against. I mean, it may not color our own personal views, but it colors the dialogue as well, and that's a good way to think about things. And of course, this colors our views too. I find this picture very interesting. Like, I wonder, is this his evolution? He's reached the status of human beings, or she, or is it devolution? Am I just turning off my brain when I'm, mindlessly scrolling because I can't sleep or whatever, and pushing the buttons and not really thinking, and then we're having a whole sort of groupthink developing out of that because they're all linked to each other nowadays, and then sometimes that leads to protests and wars and so forth. It's an interesting thought, but apparently they do like their iPads. So, back to the topic of evolution. These are some questions that came up in Christianity and by extension Islam, because a lot of the Muslim dialogue was held in conjunction with ideas that were coming out of the West from primarily Christian discussions, which Islam may or may not have problems with. I apologize for generalizing because there are so many views in Islam. One is the age of the earth. As I mentioned, and this is not directly relating to whether or not we evolved from animals, but it is part of the whole package, the discovery that the earth is much, much older than Christians had thought it was through calculating the age of the earth from biblical genealogies. As Muslims, we by and large have not had problems with this. And this is one of the interesting things that you actually find in some of the classical scientific texts. You do find some Muslim scholars. I'm going to cheat and look at the next slide. Oh, I didn't put all the names here. In any case, you do find some Muslim scholars. I had a couple names there, Ibn Sina and Nasiruddin Tusi, theorizing about the idea of petrification, so the development of fossils from very old deceased things, and also speculating change in the earth, and that the earth was indeed very, very old, which is not, it's not necessarily a new idea. Some of the ancients also had that idea, but that was something that was different in our classical heritage, which made it easier, I think, for us to not have any particular problem with the earth being very old. Humanity being very old, we'll get to that in another session. Then there's the question of whether species can change. And classically, as Muslims, I will say those who wrote about such things had two different views. Some people who had a certain philosophical view, which incidentally Sayyid Hossein Nasr still adheres to, and that is species cannot change because they exist as archetypes in the place where the archetypes live in the philosophical world, Alam al-Mithal, or the world of forms. So, a cat is a cat because it's a cat, and there's a metaphysical reality to catness, and it doesn't become something else. This is a philosophical position. It's not a position derived from scripture. Nevertheless, some people in the past, including some Muslims, they adopted the idea, perhaps because it's a very neat idea. It's a very sort of orderly and comforting way to see the world. On the other hand, there were some Muslim scientists in the past, not exactly the time of Imam Rida, but a little bit afterwards, not tremendously afterwards, who did postulate the idea that species do change. And the Quran itself is not doesn't really give a viewpoint on this. It doesn't say Allah created the camel and it was always the camel and it can't be anything else, it wasn't anything else. I mean, we understand from the Quran that Allah is the ultimate creator, but it doesn't give details on this. In the biblical discussion, this was more challenging because there was a sense that the Bible says that everything was created as it is and it stayed as it is. So the idea of adjustment was more of an adjustment within the Christian context. But by and large, we do have precedent in our historical scientific writings for the idea that things could change, and it's not against the Quran. Then you have the question of other human species. I put a couple examples there, but most of us learn in school that there were other people-like beings who lived maybe at the same time as Homo sapiens or before. And nowadays, that's even more complicated by research saying that a lot of us have some genetic material coming from other human species, with Europeans, I think, having the highest percentages of Neanderthal DNA. So, I mean, of course, the scientific findings are based on the evidence that we have at hand, but this is what the evidence suggests. So how do we work that in with Islam and the Quranic narrative? Does that somehow violate the Quran? In any case, this is one of the areas where the Shi'i hadith are actually a bit more comfortable. You may be aware that within the Shi'i hadith collection, there is a strand of narration about the atoms, not atoms, atoms that came before Adam, that there were other races of atoms. There are incidentally some interesting narrations about atoms that live on other planets, one is actually another planet, and other places, which some people use to advocate the idea that the Shi'i hadith say there are space aliens, which there probably are, but I was not invited to discuss space aliens today, so I won't. We will do that next time. I'm looking for an example, and I didn't put on the paper the example I wanted, but it's related that Abu Hamza Thamali heard Imam Zain al-Abidin, peace be upon him, say, Allah created Muhammad, Ali, and the good or the Tayyibin from his grandeur and established them as shades before their physical forms were created. Then he said, do you think that Allah did not create any creation other than you? Nay, by Allah, Allah created 1,000,000 atoms, with D, atoms, and 1,000,000 realms, the alams, and you, by Allah, are the last of these realms. So that's one of the narrations in our text, which does support the idea that, taken literally, it could mean there were other human species before our human species. Some people also interpret the ayah that I mentioned at the beginning in that way, because they ask the question, how is it that the angels know that humans are going to shed blood? Is it just that they have some insight and they know that? Or some say maybe they knew something about what happened to the jinn. But one argument that's put forward is there were other human beings prior to Adam, and so the angels had seen what had happened, so that's why they questioned Allah's creation of, in this case, it would be another Adam. Another idea that we get within the Shi'i hadith corpus is the small body of narrations on the Nas as prehistoric human beings. Now, the idea of the Nas as a sort of monstrous, humanoidish, scary monster is found in the Middle East in general. It's not limited to Shia, but you do find the term used specifically in Shi'i hadith to refer to what appear to be people who lived before the time of Adam, who were wiped out because of their wrongdoings. And so with this sort of narration, one can actually glean some sort of idea that the Shi'i hadith corpus does seem to refer to other types of human beings before our type. So that actually works fine for the idea that there were other human beings before Adam as we know him. Then there's the question of who is this Adam that is referred to in the Holy Quran? And I was thinking about this today. Like, should I really talk about this? Like, it could totally shatter people's faith. And I might get kicked out, and then people are going to be traumatized. And I thought, well, okay, whatever, I'll talk about it. Typically, traditionally, we've envisioned Adam as the first human being. Now let's set aside Neanderthals and stuff. So forget them. He's the first proper Homo sapiens that we're all related to. And certainly the Quran lends this sense. It doesn't talk about anyone before him. However, if you start to really dig into both science and what is gleaned about the history of humanity, there are some discrepancies and anachronisms. One of them being that Adam is portrayed both in the Bible and in the Hadith. It doesn't come up in the Quran as a farmer. But we know the agricultural revolution is fairly recent, and people are thought to have been hunter-gatherers for a very long time. So you could say, well, maybe the Hadith are wrong, but there are a lot of Hadith that portray him that way. Patriarchy seems to have been established around the agricultural revolution, whereas his and his children's approach is very strongly patriarchal. But I never dared to mention this anywhere, verbally before. Monotheism. Okay, we say Adam is the first monotheist and his religion got corrupted. We don't really have evidence of Abrahamic monotheism before, basically the agricultural revolution-ish. So what I'm saying is that there are some challenges here. Perhaps this is one of the reasons that one of the ideas that a number of our scholars, by that I mean Shi'i scholars. Now, I'm not trying to be exclusive, this only Shi'is can listen, because I didn't ask everyone's religious viewpoint, but a viewpoint that has been put forward by a number of Shi'i mufassirin recently, in the past few decades, is that Adam in the Quran was not the first human ever, but he was a common ancestor. So he was a forefather of all human beings that are alive today, but there may have been other people before him. And that also works with the Hadith, because the Hadith are not really clear about, are these previous Adams, are they Homo sapiens too, or Neanderthals, or something else? So with that viewpoint, Adam could have been an ancestor who lived around the time of the agricultural revolution and was our forefather and was the first Abrahamic monotheist, and maybe the other peoples were wiped out for some other problems. I don't think it's commonly known that this idea has actually been put forward to sort of reconcile a number of situations, but it has gained a fair amount of prominence. And interestingly, it's also coming up scientifically. This is an article from Scientific American about suggesting that one of the most recent human ancestors lived between 5300 and 2200 BC, which is, historically speaking, not a tremendously long time ago. No, it is still a long time ago. And I'm not saying that ancestor would have been Adam or Eve specifically. But this sort of finding, it does suggest, first of all, that we're all much more closely related than we tend to envision ourselves, especially modern racial ideas have tended to really emphasize separateness of human beings, and the idea, there's this mental model that people just never intermarried in the past and they all stayed in their village or their forest or whatever they lived in, and then only in recent times, did they mix. It's obviously not true. I'm sure even if you think about what you know of your family history, there's a lot of migration from place to place. People have been having wars and famines and, I don't know, wanderlust and whatever the issue is, for millennia. It's not something new. But I mentioned that just because some ideas surrounding the theory of evolution, were also tied into some of the racial ideologies of their time as well. But if this happens to be the case, first of all, maybe we're not as distant from each other as we seem. If this is true. And it also could work with the idea of Adam himself being a more recent common ancestor. I use the term more because I'm not saying he was like this one person. But it's an interesting idea that has some possibility. That said, it's a bit difficult to explain to kids. I'd probably in madrasa just say, yeah, Adam was the first human being, get on with it, khalas. But this idea is there, and it does solve a lot of issues. With that in mind, here are some views among Shi'i scholars on the topic of evolution, keeping in mind there is a range of views, and of course even more so if we extend it out of the realm of Shi'i scholars into just Muslims in general. I haven't personally come across any Hausa-based Shi'i scholars who have a problem with plants and animals evolving as part of the plan of Allah, of course. The problem is if someone then interprets this in an atheistic perspective and says, well, in order for there to be evolution or natural selection, then Allah can't exist, or Allah just created the universe and did the Big Bang and Allah is done. It is emphasized in the Quran that Allah is involved in what is happening, and certainly in our thought traditionally Allah is very much involved in what is happening, but as long as there is a sort of divine oversight or divine plan, how Allah chooses to create is not our business. Especially if there is scientific evidence for it. One can also get an idea from hadith and also very detailed readings of the Quran that the human being could have been formed over a period of time. I don't mean the gestation ayah, for the fetus. I mean the human species broadly. And there are some hints about this in hadith as well. Also, as I mentioned, some scholars and thinkers, because this is a new topic, have become more open to using the term Adam for any sentient, intelligent life form, which couldn't be a space alien. And somewhere else it was at a certain place in Birmingham, I was talking about whether or not it could be used for artificial intelligence. Could it be referred to as an Adam? But again, that would be concordant with some of what's in the hadith literature. This is an interesting point. The verse saying that Allah has chosen Adam has been interpreted to mean that maybe Adam was, again, not the first human, but he was the one who was selected by Allah to be our forefather, both ancestrally, genetically, and also spiritually. Because, the idea is, well, you choose something from an existing things, like I choose this water from among the iPad and so forth. Now, of course, not every scholar holds that view, but it is a view that has been put forward. The question of whether Adam's children interbred with other human species, that's an interesting one, especially because there does appear to be evidence for it, so it's something it seems like we have to deal with. There's a number of ideas about how Adam and Eve's kids had kids without being icky and weird. You may be familiar with the ideas. One of them being is that just there was no prohibition on incest at the time, and there were twins born in different wombs, and there's some ways to try to navigate it. That comes from hadith. Some say Allah sent spouses for them, one hur al-ain, one a jinn. Maybe. I mean, that's still interbreeding with something else, even if it's, not specifically like whatever other human species. But certainly one could actually read that metaphorically, that maybe it is other human species. It's an interesting thing to consider. You're going to find varying viewpoints about whether or not that seems possible according to the Quran. I mean, it's not extremely specific, again, about every ancestral detail about human beings, only that Adam and Eve, or Adam and his wife were ancestors at one point. But it doesn't really talk about all the details after that. And then, this is an interesting point from someone who, if I recall correctly, was opposed to the theory of evolution, but he concluded by saying that if evolution is proven, the Quran must be interpreted in a way that supports it. Keeping in mind it is a theory. There may be developments to the theory. There may be new theories that come up in the future. We may discover at some point in the future that we have a very incomplete understanding of how the natural world works, and the mechanisms of evolution that we thought about aren't sufficient. So there's a lot of room for new ideas, but nonetheless, this is a very, I think it's a very forward-thinking statement. It's quite different from a lot of knee-jerk statements that one finds sometimes elsewhere. And I think this is a viewpoint which should be very much in accordance with what Imam Rida, peace be upon him, would have said with respect to the topic of evolution. And so I think that's sometimes thinking about the sentiment is more important than thinking about the answer, even though, of course, it's also important in life to search for answers. And so it's a very interesting way to consider what Imam Rida, peace be upon him, would have been said, especially on this night as we commemorate his shahadat. We do know that Imam Rida, peace be upon him, was known as Gharib al-Ghuraba, the most lonely of the lonely, the most alone one, who was sent far away from the land of his grandfather, where now he has millions upon millions of followers, but there he was alone. When the caliph, who called himself the caliph of the time, Ma'mun, decided to end his life, and decided to end his life through poison. And we know that he brought Imam Rida some grapes or some dates, and he told the Imam, please eat these. And the Imam said, thank you, I don't need them, I'm not hungry. And the caliph insisted. The Imam refused, and the caliph insisted until it became clear he would not allow him to leave. And so the Imam took one. The caliph said, please take more. But the Imam said, no, this is sufficient for what you have planned. And then he went back, and it said the pain was so bad from the poison in his body that he could barely even make his way home. And when he got home, it was so bad that he was writhing in pain. And it said that as he was in pain, he asked the people to take out all the carpets from the room he was in. And why is it that he would want that when he's suffering so much? A lot of times when we're ill, we want to be comfortable. We want things to ease the pain. And it said that this is because he wanted to spend his last moments like Abu Abdullah alayhi salam in Karbala. And thus, the final moments of Imam Rida drew near. He had everyone sent out and the door locked. Only his servant was there. And then, strangely, a young boy came in, and the servant asked, who are you? How did you come in? And he said, the one who brought me here all the way from Medina is the one who brought me in the room. And it was the next Imam, only 8 years old, who had to look after the kafan and the burial of his father. إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلَبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ وَالْعَاقِبَةُ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ.
Thank you very much for that talk. We do have time for questions, if there are any questions from either side.
Thank you very much for your talk. You spoke about the evolution, obviously, and the fact that we may have grown or changed or whatever. So what happens with this gender fluidity? Do you have that as well, something that you believe is okay?
You're asking my opinion about gender fluidity. Is that what you're asking?
Yes. So because you mentioned about the change, that people change, isn't it? Yeah.
So are you asking if I think it's like an evolutionary change?
Yes, with respect to the evolution. It can, because anything can happen, the way you were talking about.
I don't know if it's really a good topic for me to give my opinion on. First, as I mentioned, it's ideologically charged. And second, my opinion is just my opinion, and it could be baseless. I don't think biologically we've evolved tremendously with respect to the mechanism of natural selection, genetic mutations in the past, 100 years. Those are the, kind of traditionally, so to speak, what people use for evolution. What I do think, I don't want to sound like weird, but I think there's a few things that might account for a greater embracing of gender fluidity in our time. One of them is that industrial and post-industrial society is not really based on gendered labor, and so you don't have the social impetus to push you into a specific gender role the way that seems to have been there in a lot of societies in the past, or still in some places today. And I think that's one thing. I think to some degree we don't really understand a lot about humans biologically, or the nature of the human species as a whole. nowadays we're discovering that it's not just, all about DNA, but things are, and, there are effects that are inherited across generations that aren't related to mutations. And I think to some degree we're also affected by some of the things that are, we deal with in modernity. By this I mean like the pollutants, the chemicals, the stuff we have in modernity that we didn't have in the past, and I think that might affect us hormonally and change. Because animals are affected hormonally.
I mean, you brought the whole thing from animals to human being, and now would that be possible?
Yeah, but I'm saying I think that there might be more gender discrepancy with respect to how people are born and how they identify in our time compared to what appears to be in the past. I'm saying it didn't happen in the past, but I think some of it might be just literally a chemical response to the things we deal with today that people didn't deal with in the past. And what I think also, just to be honest, science in our time is based on the individual organism. I can have a brain and think, and the seat of consciousness is in my brain, and you have a brain, and you have a brain, and maybe some politicians don't have brains. But, the point is we're all perceived as individual things. And the species, with respect to the theory of evolution, the species changes in accordance to what happens to the individual organisms. I think that there's definitely scope for the idea of a, if you will, a collective species awareness. And I actually am one of those who takes an ayah of the Quran that, we're created as a single soul. I personally take that to mean that maybe there is a broader species link between us. And maybe our behavior is a result of being on the edge of overpopulation as a sort of defense mechanism that we can't keep reproducing right now and expect to survive. And maybe this is a species-wide response to that, because there's also higher rates of infertility these days that can't be explained. I know I'm sounding a bit weird, but what I'm saying is I think there are things we don't understand, and some of that is being expressed in this, and maybe some other things as well. But I don't think it's a simple. I don't think it's a simple thing relating to evolution, natural selection, and mutation. But I think there are maybe deeper things that we don't understand about ourselves as an organism, as well as just a lot of other things going on. So I think that might be one reason that's seems to be more of a phenomenon today. And Allah knows best. Yeah, I deleted it before the Home Office comes gets me. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a very important talk. So I believe in evolution. I think the evidence is rock solid. I also believe in the Quran. I think the evidence is rock solid. And the difficulties are some of the verses about the creation of Adam are very specific. And I've never really been able to understand how they can coexist with evolution. I'm just wondering whether you can help.
I think that would be a long discussion. Because there are different, do you mean the materials Adam is created out of, or just Allah saying, I'm going to create Adam, or I'm going to send down Adam?
I guess I don't have such a problem with Allah saying, I'm going to create Adam. It's more, material, for example.
I mean, some people who have an interest in such things do attempt to connect some of those materials to what's been speculated about how life developed. And they do think there is that is a proper scientific reading of the Quran, or just the existence of different types of clay, for example, mentioned in the Quran as referring to the gradual creation of the human being. So I'd suggest maybe looking into some scientific tafsir which does read these ayat in a advocating way, scientifically. So I think that's going to be my answer.
Okay.
So maybe I'm sure you've read it, but
much.
just look for some more.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. You mentioned just over here.
Oh, cool. Okay.
You mentioned Sayyid Hussein Nasr quite a lot. So Sayyid Hussein Nasr's position is that evolution is not compatible with Islam, and he gives the, I think he quotes Michael Behe's refutation of evolution as being one of the ones that he takes. But he says that nothing greater can be created from something lesser. So he says the consciousness itself is impossible to have evolved. Is that something in line with what most of the Islamic scholars would say, or is that not?
I mean, that he's taking a philosophical position again at the beginning wouldn't necessarily be the approach directly taken by every scholar. I mean, there are some scholars who think that way, and some who do take a more scripturally oriented view, for example, or there's a number of approaches. As for consciousness, I think it would depend on who you ask. I don't personally see the two as exclusive. That is to say, I don't see why Allah can't send some spiritual aspect of the human being to the human being after it is physically formed. I mean, in my view, that would be a reasonable way to harmonize the physical evolution of Adam with the idea that Adam and Eve were sent down from the garden. It doesn't need to mean that their physical bodies, literally were brought down, but that there's something else that we have. That's what makes us special as human beings. I think we would agree what makes us special is not just our thumbs or whatever, but it is whatever is less tangible about us. I mean, can consciousness evolve on its own through natural means is something that it is another thing we're dealing with respect to the artificial intelligence questions these days. And I don't think anyone currently anywhere is qualified to answer that, because first of all, how do you prove what consciousness is or measure it? And second, how do you prove where it's coming from? I mean, let's just say my iPhone continues to develop and, we've got GPT 3000 and it appears to be conscious or have a soul or something. Well, how do I know, is this just something that developed technologically, or is there actually something happening metaphysically that gave it that's outside of the material realm? So I think those are things no one is going to ever be able to agree upon, but I think a reasonable traditional view among Muslims is that the soul is something that comes from Allah and not through the physical mechanism of evolution. And the awareness, and of course, when you look at earlier thought, there are different types of consciousnesses. You hear people talking about the plant vegetable consciousness, or the animal consciousness, or the mineral consciousness. So, there is more gradations that are discussed. So I guess a more precise answer is it would have to depend on who you ask. But I think a common view among Muslim thinkers is that the soul at least comes from Allah and doesn't evolve in and of itself. Yeah?
Assalamu alaikum.
In the past, wait, can you hear me? Okay. In the past, I was told by my father that souls, before humanity was created and the earth was created, souls would meet in a sort of purgatory, and they would sort of get along, and the souls that they got along with, these people would get along with each other in the time we are in now. And with the part where you was about consciousness and thinking, I don't think that a soul can almost develop, rather than in the stage of its own life it can develop, but it can't, we can't develop over time as the way Charles Darwin says that we did with evolution and that, because in the beginning when Adam was created, wasn't he asked questions like Allah asked him questions like, what is this? And he was like, that's a cloud, or that's the sun, or that's the moon. And that's comprehensive thinking. And monkeys and apes, as philosophers says, some philosophers said that we've evolved from monkeys and apes. I don't really think that's sort of possible, because I've heard a philosopher say, I think, therefore I am. And humans are too complicated and too advanced to have evolved from like species as simple as monkeys. You know what I mean?
You bring up some good points. Yeah, certainly the idea of the souls existing in the Alam Udar, so before this world, which could be temporally before, like a time before, or could maybe just mean metaphysically before, like outside of this world. But that is mentioned within Hadith, and I happen to agree with that. That idea. Some people don't accept it, but I think it's reasonable. I think it's reasonable personally. My personal view is I think it's reasonable for the physical form of the human being to evolve, like the body, the organs and the mechanisms. Although I think there may be mechanisms for that we don't necessarily understand, and it's there's undiscovered things. And of course, I would believe there's a divine hand in it and a divine plan, and it's not just Allah throwing the dice and seeing what happens. But I would hold that the soul does come from somewhere else, and maybe the human being evolved to a certain point that it could take on this type of soul, which would still be consistent with what you're saying. And maybe it's not true about the physical aspect of the human being, but it is a good point to bring that up. As for other animals, I mean, the Quran is rather optimistic about animals. The ants talk in the Quran, and Allah reveals to the bee, and who else in the Quran? What other animals are talking? Hudhud, thank you. It talks. I mean, the Quran ascribes to the natural world in general a higher level of consciousness than was done in the Enlightenment in the West. Now some people might say this is just metaphorical and the earth didn't really speak or whatever, but the Quran does say it. So I wouldn't necessarily rule out consciousness of animals from an Islamic perspective. It's just that the human being has a higher level of stuff spiritually, so soul, I guess, a more complex one, but this is my reading of the Quran and understanding of it, but they are all good points that you bring up. It's nice that you had these discussions with family.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
Okay, here. Just a theory that I heard based on some of the conversations that you've just had with us regarding different human forms, and that the racial aspects of various humans now in terms of the color and the slight genetic dispositions different in terms of how they react to even things like recently with COVID, that people had higher mortality than others. All those things have come from interbreeding between different human species that's led to the different racial forms. Is that something that you came across as part of what you were looking at?
I haven't heard that with respect to racial differences specifically, especially since racial categories tend to shift quite a lot depending on where you are. But I'm sure there's maybe some other medical effects of genetic material that we carry from wherever we carry it.
So the formation of different racial groups, if Adam was one race...
Oh, so you mean like species groups?
Well, absolutely. So, it's so we as humans, if we have evolved with different skin pigmentation, etc., because of our weather or conditions that we've lived in, is a theory, versus interbreeding even now creates a slightly different color individuals depending on, you've got your set groups. So what I'm saying to you is that there is that theory around, if Adam was one color, we've evolved into different colors, okay? And I think this is quite a complex subject, obviously. It's difficult, but it's about thinking about that sort of things about whether it supports the theory of different humans. Yeah, in a sense that has led to different humans.
I think
different
I get
colours.
what you're saying now. Yeah, it's an interesting thought to ponder. There's just a lot we don't know about our origins as people. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I know there are a couple more questions, but unfortunately we're going to end there because the time's up. Thank you very much. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Just a couple of quick announcements. Hosseini Madrasa starts this weekend, this Sunday, so please do join. If you haven't registered, please do register. Next week, next Friday, we have a talk about why have Muslims had their bank accounts withdrawn, a panel discussion with a number of different people. And the week after, we have The Beauty of Quranic Recitation, Divine Melodies by Sayyid Jalal Masumi. Please do come and join us for those talks, and for our general programs, please go to sikkim.org.uk. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
I mean, there are scholars today who question the authenticity of those hadith.